It turns out that my local county is trying to ban e-bikes on a new trail that's not even built. There was a rather lengthy Board of Supervisors meeting. It was over 2 hours of footage just on e-bikes alone. So I'm going to do my best to trim that down. When I did the recent video on the Loop Trail in Arizona and how e-bikes are not permitted, one of the things that I wondered was how did this happen in the first place? And I'm hoping that by releasing this video, we can prevent this from happening again. So here is a very trimmed down version of the meeting with my commentary. I think it's important to point out that this meeting was not supposed to be about e-bikes versus non-e-bikes at all. What this meeting was supposed to be about was whether or not the Board of Supervisors would vote to approve an environmental study that's required to have the trail built.
We're not here to discuss anything outside of the scope of the RFP. We've been getting a lot of emails and texts about motorized vehicles. That is a Forest Service policy that we have no control over, no authority over. We do not set policy as far as who uses the trail.
The 30-day comment period and then the subsequent comment period on the draft, that's where folks can give clear and specific input on whether they think e-bike should be included on this trail. Frankly, also whether they think non-motorized bikes should be on this trail, or even whether they think horses should be on this trail.
Yes, that's correct, and the 30 days is a minimum.
I feel like Heidi Hall did a good job of being very diplomatic about this whole situation throughout this video.
Is it correct that you have included e-bikes because that is a use that's already happening and so you need to assess that?
Any environmental assessment of trail use at this point would need to include an alternative that looked at least Class 1 e-bike use. That use is occurring on the trail. Our estimates are somewhere between 20 and 25% of current users.
So that's interesting that even though, yeah, it's not legal yet, 20 to 25% of the users, they're saying, are on at least a Class 1 e-bike. So e-bikes are definitely on the trails, and because of that, they need to include that in their environmental study.
So when we started this trail project, it was talked about non-motorized.
Now another trend you're going to see throughout this video is the word non-motorized. Yeah, we'll come back to that.
This sort of dichotomous approach of motorized to non-motorized is in some ways not totally useful as we manage trails today, because as we all know, we have different types of non-motorized users who can be in conflict with each other. We have different types of motorized users that can be in conflict with each other. So what we really try and look at is, what is the trail experience? What are those potential conflicts on a particular trail based on the route, et cetera, those factors that I talked about previously? So that's the question here as well. What are those users that we should include?
I feel like the discussion about motorized versus non-motorized should have stopped right there. Definitely didn't.
Ellie, is there a Forest Service policy that prohibits motorized vehicles on Forest Service trails right now?
Again, we designate uses for every single trail across the forest. About an equal number of trails that are designated for motorized and designated for non-motorized, but even within that, as an example, there are some motorized trails that are really tailored more towards motorcycles and some that are more tailored towards Jeeps, etc. And on the non-motorized side, there are some that are tailored more towards mountain bikes. There are some that are tailored more towards hiking, etc. And then there are some where we hope that people can really share, and a lot of times that works out really well.
And I feel like this gave me some newfound respect for the Forest Service system. I know that there has been some controversy about the Forest Service classifying e-bikes as motorized when most other state and federal governments don't classify e-bikes as motorized, but clearly they're taking a very different approach where they designate for every single trail how it should be used, whether that's for motorcycles, horses, bike riding, and they actually look at bicycles and e-bikes kind of in the same or similar category. It looks like this is a process that is still going on, but it gave me a lot of hope for e-bikes on Forest Service trails, even if they still decide to classify them as motorized vehicles.
Okay, now we're going to look at Class 1 e-bikes for use on the network of trails. And looking at the trail, I can, obviously I can see some real problems because you get people on motorized vehicle or motorized bikes or whatever that just don't play by the rules.
And I don't know what he's talking about.
You've been working on this, Hardy, maybe this is to you and Ellie, since 2015. How is it that it comes here so controversial? Why wasn't this resolved before coming to the Board of Supervisors?
There's technology, the changes in technology, the changes in the cycling community, the demographic of users, all that Ellie can describe. The sport has changed.
So why wasn't that discussed in your committee?
I think it was, and many of the discussions have ended in a stalemate.
This question about whether a Class 1 e-bike is a motorized or a non-motorized vehicle, there are so many different...
That would be the equestrian group in the background that you can hear. I have no issues with horses on the trails. Many of you guys probably have no idea what I did before Bolton e-bikes. I was actually working with my dad in a business building automated climate-controlled sprouting systems, and about 50% of our customers were cattle ranchers, the other 50% horse owners. So I have a fair amount of experience with that. My family owns 2 feed stores here in Northern California. They have been in the family for well over 50 years.
So many different opinions about that. And so really that's why this study is so important, is for us to look at the trail compatibility piece. In order to create a legally defensible document, I would need to look at alternatives that included all of the current uses that are taking place on that trail.
So now it is time for comments. The first person up is from a local group called BONK, which stands for Bicyclists of Nevada County.
First of all, I'm glad that we're going to try not to focus too much on the relative merits of different user groups, since we're just trying to decide whether we should move forward with this. BONK strongly urges that you approve this funding. Just to speak to e-bikes for a second, I don't own one. We're not here to advocate for or against them, but new technologies always cause controversy.
So now I have a clip from 1985 about skiers versus snowboarders.
It's like snow surfing, an idea that originated in, where else? California.
The skiers, we try and keep them separated, but the snowboards come down the slopes, and they're dangerous because if one of these skateboards or ski boards, whatever they're called, hit a person, they'd break their leg because they're just like a missile.
There are going to be e-bikes out there, and so they have to figure out what are the impacts of e-bikes.
Now this is where the word non-motorized gets mentioned a lot. Throughout this whole video, what I wanted to find out, because of the research I did on the Loop Trail again in Arizona, was why do people not want e-bikes on a trail where bicycles would be allowed? And the only argument I could find was that they have a motor. There was no other reason or logic behind it I could find.
Build and maintain non-motorized, multi-use trails. The Pioneer Trail is a non-motorized. As a non-motorized, a non-motorized, non-motorized trail. Non-motorized, non-motorized, a non-motorized, non-motorized e-bikes on non-motorized. On the non-motorized, amend the resolution for the RFP to exclude e-bikes and maintain the Pines to Mines Trail as a non-motorized trail.
For non-motorized trail, for a non-motorized trail. On non-motorized trails, we've seen riders on e-bikes and electric mono-wheel boards. They're like a surfboard or a snowboard.
So why are these people upset then?
I don't know, they just don't like how looks. They think it's dangerous. They don't want no new equipment or anything probably up there, some gadget or something.
They don't see our point. They only see their own point, and it's sort of a tunnel vision of a sort.
You see any compromise in the future at all?
No, more confrontation, so we just like to say that we don't want them at all.
I've been on this project going back as far as it started. E-bikes didn't exist. So I used to be the bike shop owner here in Nevada City. We've seen that whole process. Now it is becoming the new fad because it's bringing people back into the sport that had to leave it because of age, physical disability, many things. Years ago, they're back out active again with the access to this new technology. So at least it needs to be looked at. That's all this is about, is a study to look at that.
They're being used no differently than a bicycle because they are a bicycle. The pedal assist is just the ongoing evolution of the mountain bike.
Your vote today is not a vote to decide on e-bikes. It's a vote to decide whether to fund the public process that will analyze the issue in depth and come to an objective conclusion. E-bikes now appear to constitute about a quarter to a third of bike use on trails here. And we just haven't had any new and unusual conflicts between user group members. E-bikers are not crashing into bikes, pedestrians, or horses.
Oh, this is probably my favorite part. I was actually thinking of a similar argument as to why e-bikes should be allowed, and this lady said it. She nailed it. So I'm going to let her take the credit from here.
All three classes are restricted to a 1 horsepower motor. Like a horse, that's a 1 horsepower trail assist, just like a horse.
As soon as we allow motorized vehicles on the trail, it'll grow. We've gone from bicycles, the evolution of bicycles over time. It's going to continue. Class 1 now, Class 2 later, Class 3. And we all know where it's going. Electric vehicles are the future. A non-motorized trail should remain a non-motorized trail.
So I don't understand this at all. He said if you allow e-bikes now, they'll grow, they're going to become more popular, but don't allow them on a trail because they have a motor.
I had to retire recently. I'm disabled with a rebuilt knee, and I'm looking for another one. And I really like the trails. I like to get out, but I don't have an e-bike, but that would be a whole new opportunity for me to get back out there. And so I think you guys should consider people that might not be able to. I can't hike very far, but e-bike, I could get back out there. So
I would love to see us have 4 trails so we each could have our own access in with our own hobby. But that's not the way it is. And right now we should be pulling together to make this trail happen. I have to say I'm really disappointed in the divisiveness here. And it's critical that we come together and acknowledge and respect each other's way to use this trail.
I feel like we shouldn't even be having this conversation because it was designated a non-motorized trail. The last minute part of the e-bikes should not have been here. We wouldn't even be having this conversation. I think e-bikes are going to be great. Probably if I was going to go ride one, I'm thinking that's a great thing.
So no on the trail. I think they're great. I definitely will have to reach out to her and be like, hey, you need to get on an e-bike. You need to try it. Maybe we should even go try it on the trail and you can see what they're actually like.
An e-bike and my bike don't make any noise. I have not had any user conflict. I see horses, horse trailers. I don't have user conflict. I'm just pointing out the fact that everybody's viewpoint should be taken into consideration equally.
The original group wanted to do is develop a route open to non-motorized method of travel. And then in the scope of services, we get into an analysis of e-bikes. I want to remove the analysis of the e-bike.
So I agree you can't direct the Forest Service on what to do. However, this is the board's money. If the board is going to award this money to the Forest Service, they can do it on the condition that that this money does not fund the study of motorized bikes.
I'd need some clarification on your motion because, as I discussed, oftentimes in the NEPA process, we're required to analyze multiple alternatives. And so the question would be, in terms of clarifying the current motion on the floor, is whether that is excluding county funds going to analyze other alternatives. Because under the law, I have to analyze alternatives that are brought up during the scoping period. If the intent is for no county dollars to go towards any analysis of any Class 1 e-bike, it could be that that's funding something that would not be legally defensible.
My understanding of trail building is that you have to build a trail differently for a non-motorized as opposed to a motorized trail. Your switchbacks have to be different. Your water bars have to be different.
There is differences between non-motorized and motorized in the old definitions of motorized and non-motorized.
This guy was sitting behind for most of the meeting. He raised his hand at this point and jumped in to clarify what the differences between different types of trails are. And this is also very interesting.
The design specification I think that the ladies are referring to are things like motorcycles that do have a very different...
Just a minute, folks. Let him speak,
That
please.
have a very different design that you want on them. You want bermed turns to support the turn and not rut them out. You want a frequent drainage. In a non-motorized trail, you don't want those tall berms. But the Class 1 e-bikes or any of the Class 1, 2, or 3 e-bikes are very different than your old definition motorized vehicle. They don't have near the power, and then you're talking about nuances between just wheeled traffic versus hiking or equestrian traffic. And they have their own design features, but the design differences are you're really looking at your old definitions, not this nuance of the small motorized e-bikes. Those tend to mimic a regular bicycle.
How does the state of California define Class 1 e-bikes, motorized or non-motorized?
The state of California does not recognize or regulate Class 1, 2, or 3 e-bikes as motorized. You're not required to have a license. You're not required to carry insurance. They are regulated as bicycles. And that's why California state parks on their trails that allow mountain bikes, they also allow e-bikes.
So the state parks have already, let me finish, please. The state parks have already crossed this bridge as an organization in the state of California.
Yes.
And they categorize Class 1 e-bikes as bicycles.
Yes.
Okay.
And so they're allowed anywhere a mountain bike is allowed.
Okay.
That analysis is required by part of the regulation.
It's not going to pass without
it. It's an existing use, whether we like it or not. They need to look at it.
There are, in fact, e-bikes, et cetera, using those. So usually the fact that it's an illegal use is irrelevant to whether they have to study that. Can you legally give them the money with these restrictions? The answer is yes. However, will you accomplish what you're trying to do, which is to get the study of the trail accomplished and get that done? And what you're hearing from the Forest Service is possibly or probably not.
This is a ridiculous situation to be in. This is absolutely ridiculous. We're going to vote on something that probably will not get us what we need, just so that we can say we told them to take e-bikes out, which they cannot do by law. I'm going to vote yes just to see if we can't get this through, but I'm extremely unhappy with this process.
I'm going to vote yes. I think it's ultimately going to be problematic. It doesn't support our vision and goals. It doesn't support the users that are in the room in getting the trail built. I believe it's going to be problematic, and my vote is yes.
My vote is yes, and I agree. I think maybe that it needs to come back. You guys need to have a conversation and see what it is, and then the board needs to see it again at some point if that's the way it needs to work.
That's how the meeting went. Ultimately, they all voted yes to proceed with the funding for the study on the condition that e-bikes are removed. It was a little fuzzy on how exactly they're even going to do that, because it sounds like the Forest Service may or may not even be able to legally perform the study and exclude something that is already being used on the trail. There will be a comment period later this year at some point, so I'll be watching closely to try and figure out when that is. And later on down the process, likely in 2023, there's going to be additional comments before the construction of the trail actually begins. I think in the long run, e-bikes are going to be allowed on this trail, no matter what, because eventually the adoption of e-bikes is going to be so large, this is going to be something that they just can't ignore, but I don't want it to start out that way. So again, if you are local to the area, if you ever plan on visiting this area, please make sure that you comment. We'll be watching this closely because we don't want this to turn into another loop. And if you're not sure which trail I'm referring to when I refer to the loop, you definitely want to go check out this video right here about the trail in Arizona that's over 130 miles. It's paved, it's amazing, but they don't actually allow electric bikes.